Hello and welcome, everyone. Participants are still coming in, so I'll give it another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll officially get started. Thank you for your patience. Hello, everyone. Welcome or welcome back if you have attended one of our previous webinars, particularly the webinar in April, where we discussed the From Relief to Resilience brief. My name is Christy Baker. I'm a program officer for the Asset Funders Network and also author of this brief upon which today's webinar is based. I'm thrilled that you're all here. Thank you for joining. I wanted to just do a little bit of context on this slide. So 2020 was both a painful and pivotal year. There were widening wealth gaps, pervasive, uneven financial insecurity, police violence, a global pandemic that had disparate impacts. But there was a lot underneath that. There have been enduring inequities in our country. Our systems were built with anti-racism and oppression baked into them. And so that caused many people to reflect, including AFN, about where we were, how we got here, and more importantly, what we can do about this. So we reflected quite deeply. We looked at our own body of work, some 40-some briefs, and the recommendations that we've set forth in the past. We looked at the work of other thought leaders. There have been plenty who have been thinking deeply about equity work for quite some time. And what became clear to us is that equity needed to be deliberate in investment strategies, and it needed to be comprehensive. And it needed to be operationalized. So what we did is we created a brief called From Relief to Resilience that lays out a funding framework from relief, which is immediate assistance, to recovery and rebuild, which is about short-term financial health and wealth building, and then long-term resilience, which is about reducing the wealth gap and creating financial security for all. And this was no easy task. And today, this webinar is a complement to what we shared in April, where we introduced the brief. And Beth, if you could put in the chat how folks can access the brief upon which this webinar is based. And if you also want to access the recording to the April webinar, that might be helpful. It introduced our framework. It introduced a set of recommendations. We'll go over some of those today. And as so much of what is causing inequity today is structurally based, much of the recommendations and framework that were laid out really centers on system level changes. And that's what we're going to do a deep dive into today. After I do some level setting, we're going to hear some funders from some funders who are leaders out there in terms of integrating equity. So at this point, I do want to thank and acknowledge our speakers. So today we have Jeff Kim, who is from the California Wellness Foundation. We have Dr. Denise Herrera, who is from Alma Health Foundation. And we have Reverend Corey Anderson from the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation. We are so excited to hear from them. I can't wait to engage in some conversation about them with them to bring how to integrate equity to life. So you can find all of their bios on our website, which is assetfunders.org. So on the next slide, I just want to go over some of the technical logistics. We are recording today's webinar. So if you want to go back to the webinar after this, we'll be sending everyone a link after the presentation in just a few days. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please let us know by using the questions box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. That's also how you'll be submitting any questions that you have along the way for our speakers. Finally, we are offering closed captions today as well, if you want to turn those on at the bottom of your screen. On the next slide, I want to remind you who AFN is if you are not familiar. We're a membership organization of national, regional, and local grant makers who are advancing equitable wealth building and economic mobility. And then I do want to thank the sponsors of the brief, From Relief to Resilience, which I have referenced. And those are the Citi Foundation, JP Morgan Chase, and Prudential. We're really grateful for the support in this work. So let me explain how the next hour is going to go. I will share a very abbreviated version of the brief's overview, the framework, and the funder recommendations. Then that'll be about 5 minutes or so. After that, I will engage in a conversation with the funders who have joined us today to hear about how they're advancing equity in the work that they are doing. And then we'll open it up for about 15 minutes of audience questions. We also have some questions that folks have already submitted in advance that we're going to integrate into the dialogue. I promise to wrap us up by 2 p.m. Eastern time. So we do have a poll, as we do here at AFN. We like to know who's joined us today on the call, at least by sector. So if you could let us know what best describes your role in the asset building field. Are you a funder or financial institution? Are you a practitioner, a public entity, a policymaker, or do you have some other role that you play in the field? So take a moment to answer that. And then we will share who is with us. All right, so it looks like we mostly have funders and financial institutions on the call, approximately 50%. Followed by practitioners at about 1/3. And then we have a few policymakers and public entities, and then a few others. I'm always curious, what that means, although we can't really engage in a conversation about it. So we're thrilled to have you all here, and thank you so much for joining. And now I want to just provide a little bit of background on the brief that we released in April. So as I shared in my introductory remarks, I talked about what was going on in 2020. I talked about the underlying inequities and how 2020 really exacerbated and exposed those underlying inequities. And so in response to what 2020 unearthed, we created a framework and a set of recommendations to support that framework that help funders explicitly place equity at the forefront, both in terms of race and gender. It's flexible, but it's structured at the same time. We recognize that some folks have been engaging in equity work for a long time and have used an equity lens. Other people are new to thinking about funding investments in these ways. So we really wanted to provide multiple points of entry so that folks can think about how they want to reimagine investments and operationalize equity into their work. And then finally, we created a set of case studies that bring our framework and recommendations to life, and how to integrate equity into the work. There are 8 of those in the brief, and both Alma and Winthrop Rockefeller were included in those case studies if you want more information on those. So on the next slide, I do want to share some of the definitions that we are using in our framework. We are thinking about a lens that is both anti-racist and leads with equity. And so for anti-racism, we're defining that as a deliberate practice that dismantles the harmful systems that are in place that perpetuate exclusion and bias. And then for equity, we're thinking of that as the set of conditions where identity factors such as race, gender, ethnicity, disability status, and the like do not predict either life opportunities or outcomes. So our framework really centers this lens of equity and anti-racism. In order to do so, it also centers the communities that are most impacted: women, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian people. And it really has a strong component around dismantling and reimagining the systems that perpetuate inequity. And as I said before, today's webinar is really focused on how do we think about and approach systems level change work. On the next slide, at a high level, I want to try to explain the framework that we laid out. There's layers to it. So one layer is from a timing perspective. Are we thinking about what's called for in the immediate, where people are most worried about financial stability in the short term and need adequate cash flow, enough income, and affordable essentials in order to achieve that financial stability. Then we have recovery and rebuild as people achieve a sense of financial stability. How do they continue to build on that stability, increase their financial health, and start to think about wealth building? And then over the long term, thinking about resilience. What are the long-term goals that people have? How do we reduce the wealth gaps? How do we think about financial security broadly, both in terms of asset building and protection? So this was a response to what was happening in 2020. But it's also an overarching way to think of investments, because at any given moment, families are going to be in different places in terms of their needs. So it's both time sensitive and timeless at the same time. Each one of these R's, as we call them, relief, and then recovery, rebuild, and resilience, has a set of opportunities to make funding investments along on the ground programs or systems change. And altogether, it's about reimagining an economic system that is more just. So on the next slide, I'm only going to go through one of our tables. So each of the R's that I just mentioned has two tables. So this one is for resilience and its system level changes. It also has a sister table, as it were, that talks about on the ground programs that can be supported as well by funders. So each of the R's has one of these. Resilience, as I mentioned before, is primarily focused on reducing wealth gaps. It's focused on long-term resilience and sustainability of families. It considers systems such as education and health. And for the system level changes, there's a column for opportunities to invest at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. So these investments might look like investing in advocacy organizations or grassroots organizing organizations. And it could be research. It could be a variety of ways that it gets played out. And as you'll notice on this slide, there are some bullets that have colors associated with them. So the teal ones would be opportunities that directly speak to reducing the wealth gap. So things like baby bonds, guaranteed income, a federal jobs guarantee, targeted reparations, student loan and affordable college reform to make college more affordable, because the student debt crisis is disproportionately impacting Black and Latinx students and people. And then there's a few where the orange ones relate to case stories that were included in the brief, and then the magenta ones, I guess I would call that, refer to narratives that are included in the brief that are after these particular tables. So we really, as I said, we tried to lay out a very comprehensive way of thinking about this, but still structured and flexible. And essentially, these tables can provide a map to see where you or your colleagues are already investing, and also where there might be gaps in your footprints. And then finally, on the last slide, I wanted to share that the framework is complemented by a set of recommendations for funders to help integrate equity into their work. And we look at it around 4 quadrants. So inward, what needs to happen? How do funders make commitments to supporting equity? How do they review their policies and procedures? How do they think about their grant-making strategies at a broad level, for example? Outward would be the specific ways that you're investing in organizations, and are you centering the communities most impacted? And are you having flexible funding guidelines so that you're not inadvertently excluding folks that have trouble accessing funding and the like. Around is about who you're collaborating with and who's at the decision-making table. Are you including women, Black, Latinx, Asian, and Indigenous people? And then onward is, how do we sustain this work over the long term? How do we think about research? Are we, including people who have lived experience as researchers? How do we think about evaluating these results? Obviously, the resilience piece is a long game. So how do we do longitudinal evaluations? Are we disaggregating our data so that we can really see who's being most impacted in the work that we are doing? And so all of these have, further detail. I know this is a very short presentation that I'm doing on the framework. There's no way I'm doing it justice, but we also don't have a lot of time. And I know that I'm really eager to hear from the funders that are here with us today. So please do access this brief on our website. You can access it in chunks. The different sections can be downloaded individually, or you can access the whole brief. It is quite lengthy. I want to say it's something like 60 pages or so. And Beth, if you could drop that, the link to the brief one more time, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, so I think after that high level overview, I want to bring my colleagues into the conversation. So we have Denise again, we have Corey, and we have Jeff. So I'm going to ask them a series of questions, and if you're finding that you have some questions arise in the moment, certainly drop them into the questions or just take note of them. And I think I'd like to start with just hearing a little bit of background from each one. So I'll call on you one at a time just to create a little more order, if that's okay. So Denise, I'll start with you, and I'd love to have you briefly introduce yourself, your foundation, and then speak about how you are addressing either racial or gender equity work at the systems level today, and then how you got there, and if you've learned any lessons along the way. I know that's a big ask, but that's my ask of you, please.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for including Alma Health Foundation today. So greetings from the land of enchantment. My name is Denise Herrera, and I'm the new executive director with Alma Health Foundation, which is a private foundation located in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So we are dedicated to improving health status and access to healthcare services for everybody in New Mexico. And we do so through health policy and grant making, policy advocacy, and other investments and contributions. The work that we do directly relates to the social determinants or factors that influence health. So factors such as income and housing, for example. We try our best to focus on long-term policy solutions that address root causes and are informed by community voice. So I would say that's one of the first lessons we've learned, is to incorporate and center our work around community whenever possible. Back to that mantra, not for me, without me. New Mexico is very blessed, and we have 23 tribal communities here in the state, 19 Pueblos, and at least 3 Apache tribes. And so that's one of the biggest lessons we've learned. We try our best to leverage resources to help those left out or left behind. Just a couple of examples of things that we've supported in the past. We've funded cash grants, financial security training, workforce diversion training for women involved in the criminal justice system, and broadband access. I guess most recently related to the COVID-19 pandemic, Alma Foundation secured 2 large grants from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in 2020, totaling about $2 million. And that funding was really aimed at relief for New Mexico's large immigrant population. So we then re-granted that $2 million back into the community. So I think I'm going to stop there. I don't want to hog the conversation, but again, thank you for having us today.
Thank you, Denise. I really like how you're centering the community voice and the mantra of not for me, without me. That's really beautiful, as well as your most recent COVID responses. Those are powerful. So thank you. So Jeff, if we go to you next, yourself, your foundation, how you're addressing equity now, how you got there, any lessons?
Thanks, Christy, and thanks for the invitation, and kudos to you and your team for doing the brief and organizing today's session. So I'm Jeff Kim with the California Wellness Foundation. We're a health conversion funder. I'm sure there are others on this call that are like that. We're statewide. We've been around for 30 years, and we are completely driven by racial equity and social determinants of health. I mean, you have to be when you're in a state as diverse as California, where you have a lot of wealth, but also a lot of inequities. This calls for that approach. So we have 4 portfolios organized around these social determinants, and the one that I oversee is what we call economic security and dignity, which is really pathways to economic prosperity for all Californians, particularly those that are most disconnected from those pathways, and that often is connected to, or predominantly to, systems level barriers and reflect racial disparities. So it's kind of all wrapped into what we're trying to address. And the priorities are addressed by trying to strengthen the floor as well as opening up the ceiling. And for us, the floor, and these relate to the kind of the policy issues, the economic safety nets, particularly around income stability, when folks fall in tough times, whether individually or like we've just seen in the pandemic, whole parts of the population. And then the ceiling for us speaks to things like higher education, that pathway to economic prosperity, and also access to quality jobs through workforce development and building and strengthening small businesses. And for all of these, again, we overlay racial equity. The folks who are facing barriers in terms of all this are generally from communities of color, people living in rural areas, et cetera. We do make both grants and PRIs. And in terms of grants, a heavy part of what we do is around supporting policy, the public policy efforts. So policy advocates, researchers, data collection, organizing, grassroots organizing, lifting up constituent voices in terms of all the issues that I just outlined. I think one of the things that we've been trying to do, we are mandated to, in our charter, to support direct services. That's built in, baked in, we must do that. So what we've tried to do more recently is really connect direct services to systems change and advocacy. So organizations that work with individuals to lift up their lives, they're going to, if they're, especially those impacted by systems barriers, they're going to see some patterns. And so how do you connect the dots on all that? And how do you work on that? How do you address it, address those trends? Because those patterns are oftentimes grounded in policies that disproportionately hold back communities of color. Like for instance, as mentioned, formerly incarcerated men and women. I mean, it's just baked in that they're not going to get access to good jobs, quality jobs. There are a lot of barriers. So, and they're great tools for leadership development of community members who experience these barriers directly in terms of these efforts. So, and power building is also part of it. So that's a little bit about us. I'm going to turn it back to Christy.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. There's so much good stuff there. I like your all-in approach and that you're connecting the dots between systems change and direct service and seeing how important it is to connect the two. So thank you. And then Corey, same for you. Who you are, your foundation, how you're currently addressing equity, how you got there, any lessons?
Sure, thank you. And again, thank you, Christy and AFN for having us here today. Corey Anderson, I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation in Little Rock, Arkansas. I never miss an opportunity to tell probably the worst joke I've got is we're the Little Rockefeller Foundation. We are a small private foundation in Arkansas. Arkansas was lucky enough to have Winthrop Rockefeller, who's one of the Rockefeller brothers, Jay, Nelson, those guys. He's one of those brothers, one of those 5. He made Arkansas his home back in the 1950s, went on into public service and politics, and then unfortunately died fairly young in the early 70s. But fortunate for the state, he thought enough of his home to leave most of his wealth to establish a couple things, one of which is the foundation. Our mission, as it's stated today, is a relentless pursuit of economic equity, educational equity, social, ethnic, and racial equity for all Arkansans. And that honestly comes directly from the work of the governor. The pandemic actually reinforced our mission. It actually revealed for folks that weren't looking the inner workings of inequity, not just in Arkansas, but certainly around the world. And so our work was honestly accelerated in 2020. And the things that we focused on, and just to say, ditto to Jeffrey, ditto to Denise, we're long-term, system-focused. In our newest strategic direction, we talk about dismantling systems that don't work for everybody and rebuilding systems that do work for all. And so during the pandemic, one of the things that we keyed on in terms of economic equity, which we describe as everybody being able to live in a thriving community, earn a living wage, and build generational wealth. So one of the things that we focused on in the pandemic was making sure that small business owners, particularly Black, Latino, women, folks that live in rural areas, had the resources that they need to not just make it through the pandemic, and we're still in the process of making it through the pandemic. Arkansas had 2,000 new cases yesterday, but not just making it through the pandemic, but also to the point of what's in your brief, building some resiliency in that sector of our economy. I love, Christy, the way that you all have simplified the definitions around equity. Again, we ditto that. What we're looking for is to live in a state where you can't tell who's who by outcomes. And what we're finding, though, because so we've got a big narrative piece to the work that we're doing also, because honestly, what we're finding, and we find this among our philanthropic partners writ large, as well as our other public and private partners, is we're not sure how many of us actually believe that equity as a goal is actually possible. And so part of what we're trying to do is, one, is surface that for folks, right? Like say that out loud to people, like, hey, absolutely glad to have you at the table. But if you don't really believe that Black folks and Latino folks and others can actually build wealth in the same way that white families can, then that's a conversation we need to have, right? Like if you don't really believe, we do education work and the like, if you don't really believe, that, little Black boys are going to be able to read on the same level as their higher income peers that aren't of color, then that's the first conversation we need to have. So as we think about the direct interventions that we're doing, making sure small businesses have money, making sure that there's an ecosystem out there to support them and the like, we're also having this narrative conversation with the folks in the state to say, hey, we have to do both these things at the same time, because if you don't really believe it's possible, then we may be spinning our wheels sort of in a large way.
Thank you. You're getting a lot of amens in the chat that I can see. And
I'm a Baptist preacher too, so those are helpful.
It does add some credibility there, of course. But I really appreciate the way you're defining equity and taking it to the next level of what does that mean? It's thriving communities, it's living wage, it's generational wealth. And then while you didn't use this word, there's something about embodiment and embodying the possibility of equity that is incredibly important and really seems to be missing in many places. So thank you for that. Okay, so now that we kind of know who's with us, I wanted to get some input from these esteemed folks about what they see as the most promising strategies to address systemic inequities and create healthier, more equitable economic and related systems. So I'm going to go in a different order this time. So Jeff, if we could start with you, what do you think is most promising?
Thanks. There's a lot, and I think one of the things that we learned about the pandemic is, it just took the cap off of everything. Our own self-imposed limitations and what's possible, what we can dream. So I guess in a weird way, we have the pandemic to thank for that. So I'd say one thing is guaranteed income. It's something that we supported the first in the nation guaranteed income pilot in Stockton, California. That was, I can't believe it, only 2 years ago. That's when it was a pilot. That was when Mayor Tubbs was all by himself. People thought he was, unusual and strange to promote something like this. And now, lo and behold, pilots are popping up everywhere. And I think, what we've seen through the pandemic is the power and importance of just cash that's unrestricted, unconditional, ongoing. just trust people to take care of their lives and their households. That's really what it is about, is trust, and provides financial cushion. You know, we've seen all the stuff that's happened in the pandemic, with rent, with food, et cetera, and just having that extra cash. And we've seen from the Stockton pilot that, lo and behold, this cash actually does a lot, including promoting employment. So it bursts through all those narratives of poverty and poor people, and you know, they don't deserve this and that because they'll do bad things. Well, that's not what we found in the pilot. So it's taken off in the nation. It's definitely taken off in California. There are, I don't know, a dozen or so pilots popping up, and we feel like that's something to invest in, both individual pilots, but also the kind of the architecture on that, to do things like driving advocacy, driving narrative change, evaluating it, obviously, so that it can all kind of click up into an advocacy agenda that has to happen at the national level. So that's one thing I lift up. And then the other is something that we've been involved in for a while, which is collective impact on boys and men of color. We have in California, the California Alliance. These are funders for boys and men of color. And we started in the Obama administration. We've catered through the previous person, and it's still around. And you know, it's hard when you start something to keep it going, especially when the initial start is connected to, you know, the first non-white president of the United States. It's just, it was the momentum that you know, that came from that. But we have persevered, and we've persevered. You know, it's connected to the life course model that ties economic incomes to all sorts of parts of life. You know, shrinking the criminal justice system, creating opportunities in the workplace, in education, and I think that's also that allows for different funders who kind of emphasize different things to come into this collective approach that, again, centers the future and the well-being of boys and men of color. So those are just two from my end.
Great, thank you, Jeff. You're getting the equivalent of an amen. You're getting a lot of yeses in the chat, particularly around the guaranteed income and other work that's being done across the country, and the importance of, you know, trusting in communities and how that advances the work. So thank you.
And I'm not a preacher. I'm not a preacher.
That's why you didn't get amen. So let's go to Corey next about what do you see as some promising strategies?
Well, let me stick with one of the threads that I picked up on just in the introduction, because there's lots of stuff that we could talk about. So in response to the pandemic, everybody knows that, you know, even, you know, the last administration said, hey, we got to get resources out here for small businesses, PPP, EIDL. I know all of us have heard that, those terms ad nauseum. And I know probably everybody on this webinar knows that, you know, a little bit of hyperbole, but almost none of that money got to people that really, really, really needed it, right? So, and what I'm talking about, you know, particularly Arkansas is a pretty rural state. So the business fabric of most of our communities are these little bitty businesses, right? It's the barber, it's the mom and pop restaurant, it's the car detailer, it's the lawn service, you know, and the like, and then other small businesses. And none of those, I'm using hyperbole, but not much of those resources got to those folks, right? And we saw that early. We've had some long-standing partnerships with the CDFIs in our community, in our state, and even the CDFIs were having a hard time getting to these folks, right? So what we did was we actually partnered with community organizations in the communities that we care most about. The organizations that were already on the ground, already in communities, weren't doing entrepreneurial support, weren't doing small business support, none of that sort of stuff. But they were the place where the barber, the restaurateur, the car detailer, they were the place that those folks trusted. So we partnered with organizations like that to build out what's called Delta Owned. And basically what those organizations became were front doors into capital access for these businesses, right? As a foundation, we put up the capital. We actually partner with the Walton Family Foundation to put up the capital to get resources to these businesses. And then those community organizations act as intermediaries between those businesses and the traditional CDFIs, the traditional entrepreneurial ecosystem, right? So that was our intervention, right? We're the little Rockefeller, remember? So we don't have enough money to continue to do that at scale, right? Like we were excited, happy to do it as an intervention. The real money, right, is locked up in the federal government and is locked up in banks. So what that led us to was this broad conversation with the banks in our state to say, hey, we know that you say that you want to serve Black folks, that you want to serve Latinx folks, that you want to serve Marshallese business owners. We know that you say you want to serve women. Well, why aren't you serving them, right? Why is it that you got $1 billion in PPP money that had to go through this system, the banking system? You got $1 billion or more in this money, and yet none of that money got to those folks. And so we are having a really transparent and direct conversation, again, with the systems. I think everybody on this call has said we're systems change folks. And so from our perspective, we're going to unlock the capital that's needed to help these businesses sustain, thrive, and grow, then we have to be talking to these systems. So it's the banks, it's the Small Business Administration, and we consider these folks partners at this point, right? Now the conversations aren't easy, but we still do consider them partners. So when we think about what's the long-term thing that we can do, and this is specifically relative to how do you support the what I call sort of the micro entrepreneurial ecosystem in rural communities and small towns and communities of color. We're trying to help these big system folks see that, one, you can do it. Like it's not a bad business proposition. These folks are making money. They'll give you your money back if you lend it to them. But more importantly, you have to do it. Just picking up on something that Jeff said, and I think Denise said the same thing. As we're engaging with these community organizations who are engaging with these small business owners, what our ultimate goal is also is to begin to build their sense of agency and advocacy, right? And so what we've been saying to folks, and these are both the small business owners and folks that we consider allies, relative to these banks, like if you're an ally, if you say, oh, I agree with this, those folks ought to be, getting the capital they need to, because if their business does better, then my business is going to do better. If you believe that, the next time you go put, $1 million in a regional bank, ask that officer, hey, what is this bank doing to support Black businesses? What is this bank doing to support micro businesses? And banks don't have to do it all. Again, that's why we've got a wonderful CDFI infrastructure. But banks, private banks, and again, the federal government, they're holding those resources that can be channeled through CDFIs in lots of places who are better suited to get resources to those people. So that's one example of, like, across the spectrum. Jeff talked about direct service, right? Like across the spectrum. So on one hand, we're funding this direct service activity with these community organizations that are working with these small businesses. And then as you come back into the system, we're using our voice, we're using the leverage of the Rockefeller name and the standing, we're using that to get in and sit down with these bank CEOs, to sit down with the SBA and say, look, we're filling this gap, but what we're really doing is filling the gap that you ought to be filling, in a legitimate way. And beginning to take them through a process that hopefully gets them closer to that. We're a state foundation, but this is a conversation that has to be had at the federal level also. The Fed Reserve, the folks that create the regulations that run banks, like they need to be having this conversation also. CRA, and this is my commentary, CRA is at this point is a pretty weak substitute for what we ought to be holding the banking system accountable for in terms of community impact. And I'll stop there, because that's a whole nother webinar, and I know AFN has been moving around this area too.
Thank you so much, Corey. I think what I noticed about your remarks is it's another way to think about connecting the dots, and how systems are almost kaleidoscopes, and they operate in connection and move around each other. And this is one approach to systems change on a local level that's working really well in a rural community. So thank you for that. Okay, Denise, how about you? What are your thoughts on promising strategies?
Yeah, I guess first and foremost, I believe that instead of praising people for being resilient, we should change the inequitable systems that make them vulnerable in the first place. So I guess I would put out like a call to action for funders to take more risks and invest in innovation, entrepreneurship, environmental changes, and demonstration projects. So don't put all of the responsibility on communities, nonprofits, and people. So in terms of health, because that's what I can speak best about, I believe everybody should have access to a healthful life, regardless of where they live, play, work, and worship. And my life expectancy shouldn't be different than yours just because of the zip code that I live in. And I believe that health for all is possible. And that's what we practice here at Alma Health Foundation. The best examples I can think of are through Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where I actually worked for about 5 years. So the 911 operating system is my favorite example to use. So somebody had an idea, and their idea was that if we all had a common number we could remember, then the outcomes would be better for that person in need. And that's what we now know as a 911 operating system. So Robert Wood Johnson Foundation invested in this idea. They piloted it in about 13 different areas. It scaled up, and now it's known as a 911 operating system, which is funded by the federal government. Another example is seatbelt use, right? Like we can actually see fewer people dying because we have laws about seatbelt use, which is another example of something that Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funded early on. Smoke-free bars and restaurants, changing the environment all around us. So hopefully we could have better outcomes. Broadband is one that I think, was elevated during COVID-19. If people don't have access to the internet, they don't have access to job applications, or in many cases, education, as we recently saw. If they don't have access to internet, they might not have access to health and healthcare through telehealth services that many of us needed in the recent, past year and a half. Not having access to jobs and health means not having access to safe housing. So it's all interrelated. I would highly recommend a book for especially funders and nonprofits, really anybody, to read. It is by Mauricio Miller. And the title of the book is The Alternative: Most of What We Believe About Poverty is Wrong. And so my team, when I was with St. David's Foundation in Austin, we all read that book and we all had our own existential crisis. Because the premise of the book is that we should put the communities in the driver's seat and help them find their own solutions to the problem. And at some point, the mayor of Oakland, California, engaged Mauricio Miller, who is from an immigrant single mother family, and said, hey, what would you do to solve poverty in this area? And so we call it the unprogrammed. So a lot of times foundations tend to fund direct services, or we think that sending a caseworker out to a home is going to help that family do better. But what the family actually needs is somebody to pay their light bill. Because if they don't have, $85 to pay their light bill, their refrigerator is going to go out, their food's going to spoil, their child's not going to be able to do their homework, that sort of thing. I will put the name of the book in the chat in a minute. So thank you for asking that question. So I guess that's pretty much it. I know it's complicated, but I would encourage foundations to take more risks, invest in innovation and entrepreneurship and demonstration projects. And if you are a small foundation like we are at Alma Health Foundation, partner with other foundations in your area. We're partnering with other folks related to broadband here throughout the state. New Mexico is the 4th largest state in terms of land mass. Not a lot of people know that. So we definitely have a lot of rural areas that don't have access to internet or therefore telehealth services. So, again, even small funders can fund research related to these issues. We could fund convenings. We could serve as a neutral convener and bring together state and local government, tribal communities, other foundations, universities, that sort of thing. So I would say be creative, and again, focus on the environment. Don't expect individuals and communities and nonprofits to be able to change these inequitable systems on their own.
Great, thank you, Denise. You got the equivalent of the amen this time on the yes, the yeses. And it's time to start to move into audience questions and answers. And we've had a lot that were submitted before. We have some happening in the moment. And I think one that I want to ask now, someone wanted a better definition or a more clear definition of systems change and how to decide which systems to focus on. So I don't know if who wants to sort of start with that.
I'll jump in.
Sure.
And maybe I'll jump in and say something philosophical, and then maybe Jeff and Denise can make it real. None of them work. Like none of the systems that we are subject to work well for people of color, anybody that's different, people that aren't male, right? They just don't. And it's in your brief, Christian, you said it, and that's because when they were created, they were not created with any of us on the screen, and lots of folks in the we're not created for us with us in mind, and they've just gotten worse. And so my encouragement to the sector is it really doesn't matter like what your like thing is in philanthropy. Whatever your thing is, the system that's around that thing doesn't work for everybody. And if you don't understand the root causes of why it's not working, then you've got work to do, right? And Denise, you lifted it up earlier. Like we have to understand root causes in order to rebuild them. We wrote down on paper in our new strategic direction, and I think I said this earlier, like our goal is to dismantle systems that don't work and rebuild them so that they work for everybody. And so that's the place that we started, was that none of them work the way they're supposed to work, or in a way that's good for everybody.
Great. So essentially, you could focus on any one of the systems, but an important piece of this is to really understand the root causes so that you focus on them effectively. And then Jeff or Denise, do you have a question or additions?
Yeah, I would add that it's just a mindset shift in terms of how we look at problems. So getting away from the individual, resiliency, whatever you want to call it, individual efforts, individual, challenges. They may exist, but certain folks are dealing with more than just individual issues. So it's whatever's holding back whole groups of people and communities. Just think about what those are. It's everywhere. I mean, I think what Corey was saying is the country was created kind of all that stuff baked in, because who was doing the founding of the country was a certain sliver of humanity. So think about it in that way, I would say. There's no like definitional, just kind of your mindset about what is it that's really holding back, and I'd say intentionally holding back people in communities, certain people in communities.
Yep. Thank you for that. And then Denise, anything else on that one?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. All right, perfect. So this question came in advance, and Denise, I'll direct this to you. How can organizations embed equity and racial or gender justice into their organizational systems and norms? Talk about another system. And how can people on the ground implement equity strategies or start conversations with organizational leadership if they're not leaders themselves? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for whoever asked that question. I will start with one thing that we've done at Alma Health Foundation, which is about 20 years old this year. We actually have it in our bylaws. So in addition to our 6 core values, our bylaws specify the focus on equity and, of course, health equity for us, investments that promote systemic change, and the need to be responsive to the health rights and needs of the culturally and demographically diverse people in New Mexico. And so we always go back to those bylaws when we're talking with the board or the community advisory committee that we have, or when we're making decisions. And so I would say that that's one way, get clear on what you mean by equity, or in our case, health equity. First of all, we need a shared understanding. I would recommend that you start with an equity audit. So have the staff and the board and whatever leadership you have, I mentioned we also have a community advisory committee, go through this equity audit led by an external consultant who has expertise in this area. This is an example of something we consider funding through our capacity building work, for example. See where you are as an individual and as an organization, and then decide where you hope to be. I view equity and health equity on a continuum, right? We are somewhere on this continuum as individuals and as organizations. And I don't think it's feasible for a person to go from like this side of the continuum to this side like overnight, but we could each sort of move a notch up on that continuum, if you will. So I would start with an equity audit. Each individual needs to understand their own implicit and personal biases, as well as the organization's biases, look at everything you have, your application questions, your reporting questions, your interview questions, your recruitment strategies, like that sort of thing. I think every organization has the capacity to improve, no matter how great you think you are. Again, developing that shared language and understanding, doing that level setting. Everybody in the organization might not agree on everything all of the time, but at least if you use words like equity, diversity, and inclusion, people will know like what you're talking about. In the case of health equity, a lot of times people don't understand the differences between inequities and health disparities. And for example, health disparities are just differences in health. It's not necessarily a good or bad thing, it's just differences. Whereas inequities are things that are caused by unjust rules or unjust behaviors, things that are not fair. And so again, language matters. So those are a couple of things, an equity audit, consider your bylaws or your governance structure and actually follow that. Develop a shared understanding. And, I really believe that in order to be a leader when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion externally, you really need to do the work internally. There's a lot of information out there. Even if an organization can't afford to work with a consultant, there are tools out there. I encourage folks to build internal champions for this work, and not necessarily just people of color. As a Latina, it is very common for me to be the only person in the room, not necessarily in New Mexico where I just moved back to, but it is common for me to be the only person. And people expect me to be the person leading this work. And while I'm happy to do so, I don't think that it should fall on just one person or a few individuals. Other tools out there that especially foundations might be interested in, the National Commission for Responsive Philanthropy, or NCRP, they have the Power Moves tool, that can help guide organizations, again, to maybe move to that other step or that notch on the continuum. And so, yeah, so those are just a couple of things. Look at your bylaws, look at your rules, consider an equity audit, develop a shared language, and then use existing tools that are out there.
Great. Thank you so much, Denise. And there was a lot of alignment of the funder recommendations that we put in the brief around doing the internal work. So in addition to what Denise shared, I would encourage you to go back to the brief as well if you're new to kind of integrating equity into your work. If we can move to another question, would that be okay? Or do you have any adds from Jeff and Corey on that?
Could I add something?
Sure, of course.
Picking up on a big part of what Denise said, I think, and putting it explicitly, it does matter who is doing the doing, like who you're hiring, who the team is, who the leadership is. And I think so holding yourself accountable to have the people in place who reflect the community you're serving at all levels, especially the ones with power, that's going to really lead in many ways to more, not perfectly, but more racial and gender justice. And that becomes the system, because the people are the system, right? People are in it. And I think there's definitely a role for funders in this. If you embed DEI in your practices in terms of what you're looking for when you engage grant seekers, and you ask them for information, and you make points about the need for DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and when you ask these tough questions, and enough funders ask those questions, it does cause momentum, because it does register with the community, the nonprofit organizations, advocates, et cetera, that are doing things. So just a few things I wanted to add.
No, thank you. Those are good adds. Yeah, really thinking about the people that make up the systems is so important. So a few of you brought up narrative change, and there was a question in the chat about how important is narrative change work to funders, and how common is it for funders to be supporting that kind of work? So I don't know who wants to weigh in on that one.
I'll jump in. I appreciated Denise bringing up Robert Wood Johnson and the work on several cases that they had done, and that's what that is, right? That's narrative change. One of the ways that things change in this country, it feels obvious, right? But is that people start thinking differently about things, right? And most of the time, that thinking differently process, which takes quite a bit of time, particularly at scale, is intentional. Like somebody is intentionally saying, I need Americans to think differently about seatbelts, about smoking, about disability, about same-sex marriage, whatever it is. And somebody is intentionally saying, okay, now how do we help people move from point A to point B? So one of the things that we're doing, so we're thinking about that in the Arkansas context, right? Like one of the beautiful things about Arkansas is it's only 3 million people in the state. And we believe that particularly in specific geographies that we can actually do some of that narrative change work. So we've invested quite a bit over the last 2 years in all the research that you have to do, right? I would commend BME, who's doing a whole bunch of asset framing work, particularly around Black folks and people of color. I would commend that to folks to take a look at because the science is there. If we can change the frames by which people look at other people and look at communities, then we can actually change how people act in terms of who they elect, who they think belongs in their group, who they're going to treat well, and who they're going to be ambivalent towards. Like the research is there. To the bottom part of the question, I don't think there's enough philanthropic investment in that, particularly on the progressive side of it. I think one of our weaknesses, and I'm using progressive, et cetera, those are my words, but on the progressive side of philanthropy, I think one of our weaknesses is that we're going to rely on this moral argument for doing things right. We're going to rely on data that tells the story of how bad folks of color are treated and how bad they're doing, that we're going to rely on those things to move other people to do things. And science will tell you that that's not going to work at scale. It gets us incremental things, but at scale, it's not going to work. That it really is literally how people see other people and whether they see them as worthy or belonging that actually determines whether they're going to go pull a lever on the right side, whether they're going to go elect somebody that's going to help folks, and whether they're going to be an active advocate for other people. It's what's going on in our heads. And so we're doing some of that work in Arkansas. So if you give us 5 years, I'll come back and tell you how it's going.
Thank you. So I want to do we're at 2 minutes. And so we've had a very engaging chat. I want to thank all of my speakers who have been, responding to things that we haven't been able to say out loud by being in the chat. I think this has been such a rich conversation. I've learned a lot. I've really enjoyed it. In like a word, a phrase, is there any parting words that y'all want to give to the audience? Jeff, I'll start with you just to.
Thanks for engaging in this webinar and trying to learn. I think you also should feel like whatever your role is, that wherever you're at, that you have power to try to make change. And so do it. Take this and try to do something. Hearts and minds, mini narrative change, whatever you want to do, wherever you're at, work on it, because it's collectively we will make things better in the systems. Perfect.
Thank you so much. Corey, how about you?
I would just say thank you. I really enjoyed this. The brief time with Denise and Jeffrey. It's always good to meet new like minds in the space. The truth of it is, in terms of philanthropy, like we're still a little bitty sliver of the philanthropic sector that's even struggling with these issues. So I would just say to folks that are listening, if you've got an opportunity, like bring some of your peers along. Just start with them wherever they are and begin pulling them into these conversations, because there's so much more of the field, again, my words, that we need to come along in this journey with us.
Beautiful. Thank you. And then Denise, how about you?
I guess I would just encourage everyone to always bring their full self to their work. In philanthropy, I often say, let's blow it up. I don't know if I'll be able to do that by myself, but I do encourage everybody on this call to bring your best self to the work, because we need everybody in order to make long-lasting change. And thank you for joining today.
Great. Thank you so much. So I apologize we didn't get to all of the questions. We had a lot to discuss. And I started with 2020 being a painful and pivotal year. And I'm really going into this year with promise and possibility. And I think that all of the funders that joined me on the call today really illustrated that. And I appreciate all of you for joining as speakers. I appreciate all of you joining as participants. Please do engage with our brief and look at the recording from this webinar as well as the one in April. If you have follow-up questions, of course, you can reach out to us. We appreciate all of your engagement today. There will be a brief survey. I think it takes 2 minutes or less. And I think that's it. Just thank you so much. And do we have the speaker info? So we'll make sure it gets on the website or something. I'll figure that out. So I know folks are asking for follow-up. So thank you all so much. Have a blessed day, and we will see you next time, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you.